The voice memo came through at 11:37 on a Tuesday night while I was still in my office in Midtown. 3 empty coffee cups lined up on my desk like little monuments to overtime. I almost didn't open it. I'd been running spreadsheets for 16 hours straight. My eyes felt like they'd been rolled in sand, and I had a forensic deposition at 9 the next morning. But it was from my mother. And my mother didn't do voice memos. I tapped play. "Sweetheart, your father and I have talked it over with your brother and Tessa, and we've come to a decision as a family. After what happened at Sunday dinner, we don't think it's healthy for any of us to keep pretending. You're not who we raised. You haven't been for a long time. We're going to need you to stop calling, stop dropping by, stop pretending you're a part of this. We're letting you go. It's better this way." 83 seconds, I timed it later. 83 seconds for my mother to cut me out of her life with the same warm phone voice she used to leave reminders about dentist appointments. The reaction emojis started rolling in underneath. My brother thumbs-upped it. His wife sent a praying hands. My father, who hadn't sent a text without my mother's prompting in 20 years, wrote, "Agreed. Let her grow up." I sat in my office and watched my reflection in the dark window. I expected to cry. I'd been bracing for it since I was about 15, honestly, the moment they finally said it out loud. But instead what came up was this strange, clinical quiet. Like the moment in an audit when you finally see the pattern in the numbers and you stop being surprised. I'm a forensic accountant. My whole career is finding the lie hidden in the ledger. And the lie in this ledger was something I'd known for a very long time. I opened a new note on my phone. I titled it Tuesday, and I started typing. The first thing I wrote down was the joint credit card, the one in my name that my mother had been using for what she called household incidentals for the last 6 years. I had set it up after my dad's first heart scare because she said the stress of bills was killing him. I'd been paying about $1,400 a month into it without ever looking too hard at what they were buying. I didn't have to look hard, I knew. Some of it was groceries, most of it was my mother's face creams and my dad's golf membership, and, more recently, my brother's wife's prenatal yoga. I logged into the card portal. I didn't cancel the card. Canceling would trigger an email. Instead, I called the bank, verified my identity with my social and the security questions only I knew the answers to, and reported the card lost. I requested a new card sent to my address only. The old card would decline at the register the next time my mother tried to use it for her Tuesday morning Pilates class. She would call the bank in a panic. The bank would tell her the cardholder had reported it lost. She would call me. She would not get an answer. The second thing I wrote down was the phone plan. My parents and brother were on a family plan I've been paying for since I was 26. I logged into the carrier app. I didn't remove their lines. Removing their lines would shut their phones off immediately and send a notification. Instead, I changed the autopay method to a closed account I'd kept for situations exactly like this one. Then I switched the billing alerts off and toggled paperless. The plan would continue to run, charging a closed account until the carrier suspended service for non-payment. Estimated time to collapse, 22 days. Long enough for me to be unreachable. Long enough that they wouldn't connect it to me until it was already done. The third thing I wrote down was the cloud storage. The one with every photo my mother had taken since 2009 when I gifted her first iPhone for Mother's Day. I owned that account. I'd been paying $9.99 a month for the upgraded storage for 14 years without ever asking for it back. I logged in. I didn't delete anything. I just changed the recovery email to a Gmail address I'd made under a fake name in college and forgotten about until I needed it. Then I changed the password. 12 characters? No meaning. Nothing they'd guess. The photos were still there. They just weren't hers anymore. I closed my laptop. The clock on the wall said 12:34. I thought about my deposition. I thought about how, in forensic accounting, when you find the bleed in a company's books, you don't argue with the bleed. You don't ask the bleed why it's bleeding. You isolate the account, you freeze the access, and you document. You document like your career depends on it, because it does. I picked up my phone. I went into my contacts. I muted my mother, my father, my brother, and his wife. I didn't block them. Blocking is for people who never want to hear from someone again. I needed to hear from them. I needed every voicemail, every text, every panicked all-caps email, because every one of them was going to be evidence. Mute meant I wouldn't be interrupted. It also meant my phone would quietly collect every desperate thing they were about to say. Then I went home. I made tea. I went to bed. I slept 8 hours for the first time in maybe 4 years. I woke up to 41 notifications. My mother had called 11 times. There were 6 voicemails. There were 9 texts from my brother escalating in caps lock. His wife had sent a single message that said, "Call your mother right now, this is unacceptable." My father, who I had not heard from in any direct way since my college graduation, had sent a voicemail that ran 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen counter. I played his voicemail on speaker. "You think you're clever," he said. His voice was very low and very even, the way it got when he was about to do something he'd been planning for a long time. "You think because you make a little money now, you can punish your family. Let me tell you something. I've spent 33 years cleaning up after you. I have a friend at the state board. One phone call, you understand me? One phone call and you don't have a license. You don't have a job. You don't have anything. So you call your mother back. You apologize. You fix what you broke. And we forget this happened. I listened to it twice. Then I airdropped it to my laptop. Then I emailed it to my own work account with the subject line received 6014 AM, Wednesday Preserve. Then I forwarded it to the senior partner I report to with a one-line note, family situation has escalated. Threat to my CPA license referenced. Documenting now per firm protocol. Will brief you in person. She wrote back inside of 15 minutes. Come to my office at 8. We'll loop in legal. That's the first thing I want anyone listening to understand. If you take nothing else from this, when someone threatens your livelihood, you don't argue, you don't explain, you don't try to reason them out of it. You move first. You document, you escalate, and you put the threat on the record before they can. By the time my father's friend at the state board picked up his phone that morning, my firm's general counsel had already been briefed, the voicemail was already in a preserved file, and my partner had already drafted a memo. They had nothing. They were holding a gun that had been unloaded 6 hours before they could pull the trigger. I want to walk you through what they didn't know yet, because the rest of this story doesn't make sense without it. I left home the day after I turned 18. I tell people now that I went away for school. That's the polite version, the one I made up at 22 and have been performing ever since. The real version is that my parents sat me down at the kitchen table the week of graduation and told me they couldn't afford to keep me. They said I was a bright girl, but I had ideas above my station, and a state school would be more realistic than the program I'd gotten into. They said the family had plans for my brother that needed the resources. They said I should look for a job and tell the neighbors I was taking a year to travel. Tell the neighbors you're traveling. That sentence has lived under my skin for 17 years. I didn't go anywhere. I lived in a spare room in my best friend's parents' basement. Her mother fed me. I worked nights at a 24-hour diner and days at a tax preparation office that was so disorganized they didn't notice that the 18-year-old answering their phones was also reorganizing their entire client filing system. The owner, a man named Mr. Petros, eventually noticed. He was the one who told me I had a head for forensic work. He was the one who paid for my first accounting class at the community college. When I graduated 4 years later from a real program on scholarship with honors, my parents came to the ceremony in clothes my mother had bought specifically for the photos and told everyone in the lobby that, of course, they'd always known I'd find my way. I did not correct them. The years that followed were a slow, quiet bleed. My mother called when she needed something. The transmission. The roof. The summer my dad had his first stent put in. My brother's wedding, which they couldn't afford, but which had to look like they could, because the bride's family was, in my mother's exact words, the kind of people who noticed that sort of thing. I wired $19,000 the week of the wedding. The toast my brother gave thanked his in-laws for their generosity. My name was not in it. 2 years ago, the big one. My father's company had been failing quietly for 18 months. He'd been pulling personal money out to keep payroll going, and then he'd been pulling money out of a trust my grandmother had left specifically for medical expenses for the family, and then he'd run out of money to pull. My mother called me on a Sunday in February. She didn't cry. My mother does not cry. She just told me, very calmly, that they were going to lose the house, and that if they lost the house, my father would have a heart attack, and his blood would be on my hands. I wrote a check for $87,000. I emptied my emergency fund and took a personal loan to do it. I told her it was a gift. I knew if I called it a loan, she would feel insulted, and she'd find a way to make me pay for the insult later. I gave it to her clean. I told her I just wanted them safe. She thanked me. She did. She put her hand on my arm at the next family dinner and she said, "You're a good girl when you want to be." That was the thank you. That was all of it. A month later, I overheard her at a charity luncheon telling a woman from her church that my father had been very smart with his investments and had pulled the family through a rough patch. So that was the ledger I was keeping in my head, the morning after the voice memo. The credit card, the phone plan, the cloud storage, the $87,000, the $19,000, the decade of $9.99 a month subscriptions and Costco runs, and the time my mother needed her teeth fixed and didn't want my brother to know. I had numbers. I always had numbers. I had a spreadsheet, in fact, that I had been keeping since I was 23, not because I ever planned to use it, but because forensic accountants are a specific kind of person. And the specific kind of person I am does not stop counting just because the person she's counting calls her sweetheart. The total at the bottom of that spreadsheet, the morning after the voice memo, was $312,400. I want you to hear that number again. $312,400. From a daughter who had been told at 18 that she was a financial burden the family couldn't sustain. The phone call came at 4:18 that afternoon. I was in a conference room with my firm's general counsel and my senior partner. The conference room had glass walls and a view of the river, and I remember thinking, very clearly, that I had built this view. Nobody had given it to me. The phone call was from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was from my great-aunt, my grandmother's younger sister, a woman I had not spoken to in probably 6 years. "Honey," she said. Her voice was very soft and very tired. "Your grandmother passed last night in her sleep. Peaceful. I want you to know that before anyone else tries to tell you something else, I'm going to need you to come to the reading on Friday, 11 o'clock, the lawyer's office downtown. You know which one. There's some things in the will that your mother is not going to like, and I need you in that room. We're something you can sit still in." She hung up. "I want to tell you about my grandmother. I want to be careful, because this is the part of the story where it would be easy to make her into a saint, and she wasn't. She was a sharp, particular woman who didn't suffer fools, and she had specific ideas about how women should hold themselves, and she could be cold when she felt like she'd been disrespected. She wasn't soft. But she was the only adult in my entire life who had ever looked at me, at any age, and said, 'I see you, and I am not going to pretend I don't.' When I left home at 18, my grandmother was the one who drove 40 minutes to the diner I worked at, sat at the counter at 2 a.m., ordered black coffee, and slid an envelope across the formica. There was $4,000 in it in cash. She said, 'Your mother is my daughter, I love her. She is also a coward, and she has raised your father into a coward, and they are going to spend the rest of your life telling you a story about yourself that isn't true. Don't argue with them. Just outlive the story.' She didn't hug me. My grandmother didn't hug. She nodded once, like we'd closed a deal, and she left. I cashed her check. I never told my mother. The reading was on a Friday morning. I wore a charcoal suit, the one I wear for depositions, the one that fits like armor. I drove myself. I parked 3 blocks away and walked, because I wanted my hands to stop shaking before I went in. When I got to the lobby of the lawyer's office, my mother was already there. So was my father. So was my brother and his wife. They were sitting in a row on the leather couch, like they were waiting for a flight, all of them in black, my mother's purse in her lap with both hands on it, the way she held it when she was nervous. My brother's wife had her hand on her stomach in that way she'd been doing since the wedding, even though she was not, to my knowledge, actually pregnant. When my mother saw me, her face did this thing. It does. It softens at the edges and tightens in the middle. It's a face that says, "We are about to perform a family for an audience." She stood up. She came toward me. She opened her arms. "Sweetheart," she said. "Oh, sweetheart, we've all been so worried. 3 days. 3 days of voicemails escalating into threats, of my brother calling me a parasite in writing, of my father telling me he could have my license, and now we were sweetheart. Now we were worried." The lawyer's receptionist was watching. There was an audience. So there was a mother. I let her hug me. I made my shoulders go a little soft. I did not hug her back exactly, but I let it happen. I'd been thinking about this moment for 48 hours, and I had decided, with my counsel, that the smartest thing I could do for the next 90 minutes was to look like a girl who was tired and confused and maybe a little sorry, not because I was, but because the next 90 minutes were a deposition, even if nobody else in the room knew it, and in a deposition, you do not tip your hand. We were brought into the conference room. My great-aunt was already inside. She gave me a single look, the same look my grandmother used to give me, and then she looked away. The lawyer was a woman in her 60s named Ms. Halberstam, and she had the kind of face that has heard everything and is not going to flinch at the rest of it. She read the will. The estate was larger than I expected. My grandmother had been quiet about money, the way old money is. There was the house, which I'd known about, an old colonial on 3 acres outside of town, appraised at $1.6 million. There was a stock portfolio I had not known about, currently valued at $2.9 million. There was a piece of commercial property downtown that had been in the family since the 40s, valued at $720,000, and there was cash in a series of accounts totaling just over $400,000. The total estate before tax was $5.62 million. I watched my mother do the math in her face. She did not move. She did not breathe. But her eyes did this small, hungry thing, and I thought, there she is. There's the woman who told me to tell the neighbors I was traveling. Ms. Halberstam continued reading. There were small bequests first. $10,000 to the church, $25,000 to my great aunt, who waved it off like she'd expected it, a set of pearls to my brother's wife, which made her sit up straighter, a pocket watch to my brother, a $50,000 disbursement to my parents, with a notation that the deceased considered any further provision for them to have been made in life. My mother's hand tightened on her purse. Ms. Halberstam took off her glasses. She looked at me directly. The remainder of the estate, she said, in its entirety, the house, the portfolio, the commercial property, and all remaining liquid accounts, is bequeathed to the deceased's granddaughter. She said my name. There was a sound my mother made. It wasn't a word. It was the sound of air being let out of something that had been holding itself together for a long time. My brother said, that can't be right. My father said, she wasn't of sound mind. My great-aunt said, very quietly, she was sharper than any of you on the worst day of her life. And my mother, and this is the part I want you to hear, my mother turned to me and she put her hand on my arm and she said, sweetheart, this is so much for you. We'll handle it. We'll set up a trust, your father and I. We'll manage it for you. You don't need to worry about a single thing. I let my eyes fill up. I let my chin do that thing. I let my shoulders curl. I said in the smallest voice I could make, I don't know anything about money. I'd be so grateful. You should have seen my father's face. The relief. He thought he'd just been saved. He thought the bleeding had stopped. Ms. Halberstam cleared her throat. There is one additional provision, she said. She turned the page. The deceased included a contest clause. It states, and I'm reading directly, any beneficiary or family member who challenges the competence of the primary heir or who attempts, through legal mechanism, informal pressure, or proxy, to assume control of any portion of her inheritance, shall forfeit any and all bequests made to them under this instrument, including bequests already disbursed, which shall be subject to clawback to the primary heir. She looked up. There is also a forensic provision, she said. The deceased was aware that her son-in-law's business had been operating in financial distress and that family funds had been informally disbursed in ways that may not have been fully documented. She is instructed that, at the discretion of the primary heir, a forensic review may be conducted of any monies that left her personal accounts during the last 7 years of her life. Any unauthorized disbursements identified by such a review are to be repaid to the estate with interest prior to the closing of probate. The room went very, very still. I want you to understand something about my grandmother. She was not a forensic accountant. She didn't know what one was, really, until I became one. But somewhere around the time I became one, she started asking me questions. Quiet questions. If a person, hypothetically, wanted to know whether a relative had been moving money out of an account they had access to but did not own, how would a person find that out? I'd answered her questions. I hadn't asked her why. You don't ask my grandmother why. I knew, sitting in that conference room, exactly what she'd seen in her own accounts. I knew because I could already see it too. The medical trust, the one my father had drained and that my mother had told me 2 years earlier was empty because of treatment costs. My grandmother had outlived her own treatment by 6 years. There had been no costs. There had been a son-in-law with a failing company and a daughter who would not say no to him. I let my mother's hand stay on my arm for 1 more second, then I lifted it off, very gently, the way you'd move a child's hand off a hot stove. I said, actually, I think I'd like to handle it myself. My mother's face. I will remember my mother's face for the rest of my life. Sweetheart, she said, and her voice had a crack in it now. You just said? I changed my mind, I said. I turned to Ms. Halberstam. I'd like to invoke the forensic provision, I said, effective immediately. I'd like a full review of the last 7 years of my grandmother's accounts. I have professional credentials to assist, and I'll be retaining outside counsel as well. I'd like the contest clause read into the record so that everyone in this room understands that any further pressure, formal or informal, to redirect this estate will result in immediate forfeiture of their bequests. I turned back to my mother. I let my shoulders straighten. I let my voice go to the register I use in court. Mom, I said, I learned to count from you. You spent my whole childhood telling me to be careful with money, to write things down, to never trust anyone who didn't show their work. I listened. I have been writing it down, all of it, for 17 years. My father stood up. He pointed at me. He started to say something about the state board. I said, I forwarded your voicemail to my firm's general counsel on Wednesday morning. It is preserved. It has been transmitted to the licensing authority of the state in question as a documented threat against a sitting CPA. There is no friend you can call who has not already received a courtesy call from my firm's lawyer. Sit down. He sat down. My brother started to cry. My brother is 37 years old. He cried like he was 12, with his shoulders going up and down, and his wife put her arms around him like he was a child, and I watched her do it, and I felt something I had not expected to feel, which was a small, sharp pity. Not for him. For her. She had married into a story she did not yet understand, and she was about to understand it. I stood up. I picked up my bag. I thanked Ms. Halberstam. I walked over to my great-aunt, and I bent down and I kissed her on the cheek. She squeezed my hand once hard, and she said into my ear, she'd be proud of you. So am I. I walked out. The forensic review took 11 weeks. We found $231,000 in unauthorized transfers from my grandmother's accounts to my father's business between 2019 and 2024. We found another $44,000 routed through my mother's personal account, an amount small enough that she'd assumed nobody would notice. The clawback hit them in October. They contested it. They lost their bequests under the contest clause. The $50,000 they'd been left came back to the estate. The pearls came back to the estate. The pocket watch came back to the estate. My brother's wife filed for divorce in November. I do not know what she knew. I do not need to know. The house, my father's house, the one I'd saved with $87,000 2 years before, went into foreclosure in January. I did not save it again. I was not asked to. I kept my grandmother's house. I moved in last spring. There's a window seat in the upstairs hallway where she used to sit and read in the afternoon light, and I sit there now sometimes in the same light with a cup of tea, and I think about her. I found something in the back of her desk drawer the first week I lived there. It was a photograph of me at about 9 years old in a school play, dressed as a tree. I am very serious in the photograph. I am holding my branches up like I have been told they are important. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting and pencil, it said, she is going to be a hard one. Good. I keep it on my refrigerator now. I want to say one thing to whoever is listening because I think this matters more than the rest of the story. If your family has spent your whole life telling you a story about who you are and that story is small and you have started to suspect the story is wrong, please stop arguing with them. You are not going to argue them into seeing you. They built that story because they needed it. It does jobs for them. It is load-bearing. You don't change their mind. You change the locks. You change the password. You change the auto-pay. You write down the numbers, quietly, for years if you have to, and one day, when the moment comes, you put the spreadsheet on the table and you let the math speak. The math is patient. The math doesn't care if they call you sweetheart. I think about that voice memo a lot, even now, more than a year later. 83 seconds. That's all it took for my mother to undo 33 years of pretending, and the strangest thing is, I'm grateful for it. Not in the way people mean when they say everything happens for a reason. Because I don't believe that, and I don't think you should either. I'm grateful because my mother finally said the quiet part out loud, and the quiet part is the only part that ever mattered. Here's what I learned, and what I want you to take from this if you've sat through the whole story with me. Cause and effect are not poetry. They are not karma. They are a ledger. Every choice my parents made for 33 years had a balance attached to it, and every dollar they took from me, every lie they told the neighbors, every time they told my brother he was the smart one in me, I was the difficult one, those choices accrued. They were not free. They were borrowed against a future none of us could see yet. My grandmother saw it. She kept the receipts in her own quiet way, and when she died, she handed me the ledger and said, settle it. The lesson is not that I won. I don't think of it as winning. I think of it as the math finally being shown its work. If you are listening to this and your family has a story about you that does not match the person you have actually become, I want you to do 3 things, and I want you to do them in this order. First, tell yourself the truth. Tell yourself the real version of your own life and write it down somewhere with dates and numbers and specifics because memory is soft and paper is not. That is the foundation of every other thing you will ever do, and without it, nothing else holds. Second, build something they cannot take. A career, a skill, a friendship, a bank account that is yours alone. Do it slowly if you have to. Do it in the basement of your best friend's mother's house at 19, the way I did, by stocking shelves and answering phones for a man named Mr. Pound. Petros who paid for your first community college class because he could see what your own father refused to see. Build it quietly. Build it on purpose. The day you need it, it will be there. Third, when the moment comes, and it will come, do not argue. Do not explain. Do not perform your hurt for an audience that has spent your whole life rehearsing not to see it. Just move. Change the password. Change the autopay. Document the threat. Forward the voicemail. Sit in the lawyer's office in a charcoal suit with your hands folded and let the math speak. I am not a hero in this story. I am a woman who learned to count and who waited. That is all. Anyone can do that. It does not require cruelty. It does not require revenge. It requires only that you stop lying to yourself about what is happening and that you keep moving, very quietly, in the direction of your own life. The rest is just paperwork.